vou pedir para que esteja com a câmera aberta novamente o Tom Robinson, da JDRF, e agora ele vai nos falar sobre quais cenários simulados no T1Dindex indicam caminhos promissores para aumentar qualidade e expectativa de vida de pessoas com diabetes no Brasil. Então, isso eu gostaria de enfatizar. Muitas pessoas não sabem ainda que o T1Dindex ele tem essa característica. Ele também é um simulador de cenários, então permite que sejam simulados cenários futuros, né, de acordo com ajustes aí de políticas que podem ser feitas naquele país. Muito obrigado, Tom. Você tem 10 minutos agora para apresentar esse simulador.
Thank you, Mark. And I hope the translation is still working okay into Portuguese for those listening. The simulations that Mark was referring to are something that we have started to use a lot internally at JDRF. Because we built the T1Dindex as a simulation that is trained by machine learning models, but that effectively simulates a country and its health system and what that means for the outcomes of a person living with type 1. We've started to look at different interventions and say, okay, well, if we did this, what kind of an impact might that happen? What might that have for somebody's life? And what I've done here is I've done a very simple, almost naive exercise, repeating that for the Brazilian context. And so what you're looking at here, first of all, is a simulation of, for a person who is 10 years old in Brazil who develops type 1 diabetes, what can their expectation be over a lifetime if they have a certain type of care? So you can see on the far left, if they're not diagnosed and they're 10 years old, then that's it. They will have only 10 healthy years in their life. They'll probably sadly die within a few months. You can see with the blue box around it, there's a version which we, from the feedback we've heard from people in Brazil, but also what the model guesses based on other factors about healthcare in Brazil, appears to be the most common regime, which is NPH and 2 strips per day. And you can see there that we're looking at 49 healthy life years with type 1. And then there's also in the darker, the lighter blues, time that is lost to care and time that is lost to disability and complication. So that's time that you'll still be alive for, but it's time that in a sense is, in the case of the care itself, is invested, as Mark said. But in the case of complications, for example, if you have to spend 2 days a week at a clinic receiving dialysis because of kidney trouble, then that would be time that you've lost. So that's what the lightest blue there is. And so we treat that as time that's just lost. What we really want is healthy life years for people. And then what I've done after that is gone through and modeled out what the healthy life years for a person who's 10 years over their lifetime might look like with upgrades from that. So for example, if you go from human insulin to an analog insulin and still have 2 strips per day, that's probably an extra 3 years of healthy life over your lifetime, just from that alone. I do want to make one note about this, which is that this is missing a lot of the benefit of analog insulin. This is purely your disability and complications and life expectancy. It doesn't include things like analog insulins are easier to learn and use, or analog insulins give you more flexibility, and so you need to make fewer sacrifices in your life to be able to achieve good outcomes and good glycemic control. It doesn't take into account things like having a greater propensity to hypoglycemia or unawareness of same, and the importance of analogs in that situation. So this is based on the very much just the core physical model. And I think a lot of the quality of life benefits of analogs are not well captured in literature. So I just want to call that out clearly, that when I say it's worth an extra 3 healthy life years, I know that's not the full benefit of analog insulin. But that's what the model suggests is the incremental benefit of that transition of insulin type. You can see the next column along there, the fifth column. It says human insulin and 5 strips per day. And the estimate here is that that's worth an extra 9 healthy life years relative to that Brazilian standard in the blue box, which is more than analogs. It also requires more than analog insulins, right? If you switch to analogs, you're just using analogs, you don't have to change too much. If you switch to 5 strips per day, you're asking the person living with diabetes to test 5 times a day, and spend more time, invest more time in their care. So there's a requirement of further investment beyond just the strips, and I want to acknowledge that as well. But the data we have suggests that someone who is testing 5 times per day can often achieve really remarkable levels of glycemic control, and frankly, can outperform the average person in a country like the United States, where they often have access to much more expensive care. And in fact, this number here of 58 healthy life years, I think, is slightly ahead of the number we see in the United States. Of course, it shouldn't just be a choice between more test strips or analogs. I think if you can get analogs and 5 strips, that's even better. It's not always true that you can add the 2 together and get plus 12, as we have here, but in this case, you can. In this case, the simulation produces a similar result as if you just added the 2 together. So if we could get analogs and 5 strips per day for everyone in Brazil, let's be clear what this is suggesting. It's suggesting that the average person will get an extra 12 healthy life years, which you can spend on whatever you want. That is an incredible dividend of time, and I think a really important and powerful goal to strive for. I do want to point out a couple of other things on here before I exceed my time. One is, if you go to the far left of the page, someone where we have the no diagnosis column, someone who isn't diagnosed loses their whole life. That's a terrible tragedy. And the stories and the estimates suggest that it's all too common. And so what I did in producing this working draft of the numbers of what different interventions could be, is I'd looked at the estimates from doctors in Brazil of how common non-diagnosis was. And then I applied to that the fact that every person not diagnosed loses effectively 68 healthy life years. And I multiplied them together to get the bottom row of this chart, which is, I've labeled it reform healthy life years, reform HLYs. And if you could diagnose everybody in Brazil who gets type 1 at onset and get them onto care the way they deserve, then that's probably worth something like 6 million healthy life years for the country. That's the return from that investment. And if you go through and apply similar methods of, taking the people affected by, the people who benefit from the change and multiplying it by the Halley's per lifetime for each, if we could get analogs for everybody in Brazil, that'd be worth 2 million healthy life years. If we could get 5 strips a day, that'd be worth 5 million healthy life years. If we could get both, that'd be worth 7 million healthy life years. And so what that suggests to me is that it might be true that getting analogs and 5 strips per day is the biggest, best goal, like immediate goal that could be strived for, and that making sure we diagnose everyone, especially in more remote settings, is the next best thing to go after in terms of big chunks of time that can be given back to the community. Just to level set, I mean, this 7 million healthy life years is an enormous amount of time. You could send people to space if you had that many working hours. You could build the pyramids dozens of times over. Like, it's a huge, huge return of time to the type 1 community in Brazil. The last thing I'll note is that I haven't put estimates around the effect of analog and CGM and analog and hybrid closed loop, which is the furthest right columns. And you can see, though, that the lifetime healthy life years for both are the best. An extra 16 or even an extra 22 healthy life years. The benefits here are extraordinary. And I think we should look at what it would take to make that possible for everyone in Brazil. Can we find out how to make hybrid closed loop cheap enough and cost effective enough that everyone can have it in this country? I think that should be a goal that we chase after. That's the way we make sure that when we finally find the cures for this thing and beat it once and for all, as many of us are around as possible to enjoy that day and celebrate that day. So this is just some preliminary intervention modeling. It is subject to assumptions. And again, I welcome people reaching out to comment and offer feedback and suggestions to improve this. But I hope that this also can be potentially helpful for discussions about where it's fruitful to focus time and effort as advocates in Brazil.